Also, a very good morning and a warm welcome to this series of webinars brought to you by the United Nations in Zimbabwe as we continue celebrating UN 75 and just continuing to see the different things that people are doing in order to achieve their sustainable development goals. I know they've been sounding like very lofty ideals that are talked about at policymakers or stakeholders or other big words that maybe doesn't necessarily cascade to what it means to the ordinary man in everyday life on the street. And this series of webinars are meant to unpack this so that it comes to practical bits. My name is McDonald Guramin. Thanks for joining us today. And our panel today consists of Sustainable Development Goal Consultant, that's Anna Brazier, and I know she's very active with regards to the issue of climate action. We've also got, Anna, how are you doing? We've also got Carl Joshua Ncube, a comedian and a celebrity chef, who's wearing the hat of Chief Executive Officer of Ekaya. We'll get to hear more from him there. And then, of course, we've also got Newsbay, Tagawira, the former news anchor, now Judicial Bay, I understand, will be wearing a hat as a Wildlife Conservancy brand ambassador to just give us more perspective. Once again, thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. And it's broadcasting on the 263 Chart platform as well as the UN in Zimbabwe platform. Go ahead and like those pages and follow us. And we'll be engaging in terms of just seeing today the growing trends when it comes through to climate action. We'll just start off with you, Anna, this morning. Thank you very much. I know you've been very active in terms of climate action since we met some 2-3 odd years back, and I know you're very, very in touch with what's going on with regards to climate change and climate action. Of course, this is to do with SDG 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals, but just tell us a bit more about your experience as a consultant in the field and, obviously with particular regard to climate action.
Thanks, MacDonald. Well, for the last probably 10 years, I've been involved with working with farmers in various parts of Zimbabwe, trying to help them to adapt to the changing conditions, trying to help them to improve their natural resources, and mainly trying to help them to access nutritious food, which is becoming more and more challenging in Zimbabwe. But apart from working with farmers, I've also been working a lot with urban youth groups in various parts of mainly Harare. And that's been extremely inspiring, a very contrasting experience. I've also written a book about climate change for policymakers. And after doing that sort of very lofty research book, I then made some booklets which were translated into Shona and Ndebele to try and make the information more accessible. And I think what I've come to realize in the work that I've done is that people know something's going on, but they're not very clear about what's happening and what they should be doing about it. So they really need a lot of help when it comes to that kind of thing.
All right, thank you very much for that, Anna, and just giving us your perspective. Carl Joshua Ncube, I know you've been in the influencer space for quite a while, but you've been embarking on new projects where you've gone out in Vic Falls. Can you just tell us more about the Ekaya concept and what's going on there? You're barely audible, Carl. I can barely hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Fantastic, I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you clearly.
Okay, cool. So what we've done is we've taken a more capitalist view of bringing about some of these issues to do with climate change. As Anna quite rightly said, people know there's something going on, but they don't quite know what it is. And from our extensive travels around the country, the issue that's here is that it's very difficult to let people know of something you've already seen, but they haven't actually seen the effects of it. Now, how I got into this space was pretty much my tours around the world. When you go from one plane to the next, the amount of plastic that you're using, when you go into these cities and you see the smog, you see a lot of the effects of what's happening around the world, and you hear all these complaints. And then you come back home, and then you realize you can start to see the effects of how things are changing. So how do we package this information in such a way that people are motivated to make these changes much faster? And so Ekaya comes into the space of tourism to bring rural tourism at the forefront from a commercial perspective, to say, here's how you can make money from rural tourism. But in order to do this, we've put in a franchise model that makes people actually take on certain decisions like harvesting biogas, utilizing solar, using building techniques that are good for the environment, like our building systems, avoid the cutting down of trees within the rural communities that we're going to be working in. So, but what we're doing is that we're framing it using some of these principles like franchises and so on to condition people into the whole idea of looking after their environment by pushing them from a business perspective. So in a nutshell, IKAYA is just there as the think tank to bring about rural development and push the agenda of sustainability.
All right, thank you very much, Carl. And Rumbita Kawira, I know you've been quite active on the issue of wildlife conservancy, and you're quite an ambassador there. I've seen you go to different places, and there's been a thorn in the flesh for many people that are, Carl did allude to, people living in the rural areas, but there's always been also that human-wildlife conflict. Maybe if you can give us your opening remarks and just your experiences with regard to that.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, McDonald.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, Ruby.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, fantastic. I can hear you loud and clear.
For this opportunity. So as you rightfully mentioned, that there's a lot of human and wildlife conflict that has been happening, especially in areas surrounding our game parks or game. So let me explain that a little bit. I'm a WildAid ambassador. WildAid is an international organization that is trying to push the agenda to across Africa and across the world. But within that same context of stopping poaching, just trying to protect our wildlife, there also comes the question of protecting the people who are in areas that are surrounding, that are in these areas, places surrounding the wildlife conservancies, because they have a lot of challenges with dealing with human and wildlife conflict. It has become a global problem, and it seems has been a reason. The reason why there's been a lot of human-wildlife conflict is overlapping requirements. More humans are getting into the spaces where wildlife has been populating, and there's more growing wildlife as well within our countries, within our game parks. For example, elephants, just in Hwange National Park, so many elephants in that area, and they tend to then encroach into residential areas because of the drought, for example, which has been caused by climate change. And they also need water. Water has been a challenge. So they end up encroaching into residential areas. And what we've been doing with WildAid, I've been having chances to move around and try to see how people have been living in so many different areas. And you see so many people who are disgruntled that in areas surrounding wildlife conservancies. So some of the people would then tend to say, so you care more about the wildlife. Yes, it is our national heritage. We've got so much wildlife, but also contributes to tourists around projects, trying to ensure that the people are protected. You'll have the chili guns, for example, to ensure that elephants are not coming through and encroaching into people's farms, trying their best. They're trying to put fencing and all that stuff, but you've got a campfire project, for example. They're also trying to get into there and helping the communities. So there's hunting that is also done in some of these areas, and some of the money that comes from hunting then goes back into the communities to help them, to safeguard them, and to ensure that they're also protected from some of the issues that then stem from human and wildlife context. I mean, we've noted how human wildlife conflicts have escalated because of some of these changes in land use, arable farming, and conservation, on environmental conservation vis-a-vis human-wildlife conflicts has become very difficult to ignore. So I think with this platform, we can present some of the opportunities that we can share our views, on how best we can actually achieve sustainability where it concerns our environment. It's really carcass poisoning. That's human-wildlife conflict, where people are then killing these animals because they've come into their farms and they've eaten their crop. So they're going to come back and fight back. So there has to be a win-win situation at the end of the day. Or carnivores attacking and killing livestock and humans. Stuff like that has been happening, and now we have to come up with a way of how this can be dealt with and how we can ensure that our wildlife is protected, whilst at the same time we're also protecting the people living in the areas surrounding these wildlife conservancies. So I think this is a great platform, and I think we can come up with something that we can work around in this area.
You bring about a very interesting point there, which has been a bone of contention, and I think I'll ask this question all around the panel because obviously we're more conversant around this. The issue of wildlife, and you get the notion from people living in the surrounds where they are, where there is wildlife, say exactly what you say. You're more concerned about animals more than us human beings, and we need to be fed. I see, Carl, you're nodding your head there. Carl, you might want to jump in.
Yeah, so it's a very important thing. A documentary we just did around the country showed, a lot of people, the issue surrounds the crops, right? Because you can't then ask a person that, listen, we want you to grow stuff, but at the same time, we're protecting this animal more than we're protecting you. And these are very valid concerns. My argument, though, is a little bit different on here, is to say, have we explored the utilization of these rural homesteads that are around the national park and bring them into the tourism discussion? Because from a business perspective, if I had a rural village and an elephant passed there every day, then I know in terms of hotel night, I'll probably make more money than I would from agriculture. Now, is this information being transmitted to the people in the village to say, listen, if people came together in cooperatives and so on, and you created a platform where they can benefit from this tourism money, not necessarily get a share of, say, campfire proceeds, but do they realize the value that they have of having those animals pass through that particular land as a hypothesis? This is what we are trying to explore as a Kaya, to say, let's bring rural into the conversation and see what revenues we can make, rather than try to force the issue of continuing with agriculture in an area where clearly we're going to actually have problems. Livestock are going to be eaten by lions, crops are going to be destroyed by elephants. I currently live in Victoria Falls, so I know very well my human animal conflict is with baboons. I mean, they've destroyed my house multiple times. But the issue that's there is that there's also a revenue earning potential that's there from the displaying the unity between humans and animals, which I feel the rural community can benefit from.
All right, thank you very much for that contribution. Anna, you're following in with them. I can see you smiling and just agreeing to an extent with what's going on here. But let's talk about the issue of food security. And I know you've written about this with regards to climate change, and it's really such a Pandora's box, if you want. This whole point of food security, as well as the issue of wildlife conservancy. What's your personal take?
Well, firstly, I'd really like to agree with Carl. And I think that I don't think any kind of natural resource conservation, be it wildlife or be it forests or be it anything, is going to happen until people value or get some value from some tangible value from those resources. So while we know that people are getting clean air and clean water and fertile soil from natural resources, those are not things that people necessarily identify with. Whereas, unfortunately, because we're living in a capitalist world, people do identify with money, and they need money. They have to have it for survival in this society. So there have to be ways found to enable people to make money from those natural resources. And national parks are a huge problem, because a very small minority of people, most of them foreign or white, benefit from national parks, whereas a lot of the communities who live around national parks just suffer as a result of the wildlife. And so what Carl's talking about is really important. that we've had the campfire model in Zimbabwe for many, many decades, and people have just complained and complained that they haven't received enough revenue. So we don't need to throw out that model, but we need to find ways to actually make sure that people do realize some kind of monetary value and identify and realize the other types of value that they get from these natural resources. There's no point in just putting a big fence around natural resources and saying these are very important, because that doesn't help the majority of people. So in terms of food security, what we'd really need to say is we've got to stop blaming climate change for everything, because a lot of our food security problems have a much deeper root. There are problems that date back to the colonial land grab that happened in this country, where people were pushed into very marginal areas. The best land was taken away from them, and they've been forced to try and eke out some kind of survival in very difficult soils and very difficult climate. So that's number one. Number two is, since independence, unfortunately, the focus has not been on protecting natural resources. And if you don't protect natural resources, then you get serious impacts. And one of the major impacts has been massive land degradation. So we have terrible soil erosion, we've got massive deforestation, we've got huge depletion of our water resources. And this is all because government has been focusing on other issues and has not been doing the job of protecting those resources and forcing people not to exploit them. At the same time, what's happened is that the traditional mechanisms that existed with traditional leaders who were supposed to be the custodians of those resources has broken down. The traditional leaders have lost power. So the fallout from all of that has been massive natural resource degradation. Now, of course, agriculture and food security depends on natural resources. You can't grow crops unless you have very fertile soil and excellent water. And the kinds of crops that people have been pushed to grow through colonialism and also through the subsequent policies that people have taken on after independence are exotic crops that need very fertile soils and lots of water. Instead of encouraging people to grow traditional crops, which are much more drought resistant, they're much more pest resistant, more nutritious, ironically, and need less water, people have been trying to grow foreign crops. And that has caused a massive food insecurity problem. Now, what I've been doing this year, which is really exciting, and I'm going to bore you with it for a couple of minutes, is I've been doing a study on indigenous knowledge in Zimbabwe. We've done a nationwide project where we've consulted people all across Zimbabwe to find out what people used to do in the past. What did people do before whites came? What did people do before capitalism? What did people do before, they had all of these pressures that they have in the modern world? And we've gathered all this information together and been analyzing it. So I think one of the main messages that we've got from this is that we don't need to start again. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. People had amazing ways to survive in a very difficult environment in the past. The problem is we've just thrown away all those methods and tried to import foreign ideas and foreign methods instead. What we need to do now is take some of those practical, relevant indigenous knowledge systems and integrate them with modern scientific ideas and come up with a homegrown agricultural policy that is relevant to Zimbabwe in the 21st century and also relevant to a very difficult changing climate. So, yeah, there's a lot of work to do, but we need to start at both ends. We need to start with farmers and we need to start with the policymakers and work in from each direction. The farmers already have the knowledge, they just don't have the confidence to practice what they already know because their confidence has been taken away from them. They've been told that their knowledge is stupid, primitive. Extension officers have come in and thrown big words at them. White people in very small, tight shorts have come in and told them that everything they know is wrong. And they've lost confidence. We need to give them back their confidence. We need to say, you guys have been farmers for thousands of years. You know what you're doing. Let us help you. That's all we need to do.
quite some interesting points. I don't know whether you were clapping your hands at the tight white shorts cow or everything, but you did quite a number of significant points. And we're talking about growing trends in climate action. And I noticed something there. I don't know if it's the norm, Rumbi, as we get to you. What Anna is talking about is saying the growing trend is to actually go backward and find out how the ecosystem worked before it was interrupted and messed up. What has been your experience, Rumbi, in your area of wildlife conservancy?
Well, that is a huge point that Anna makes there, because you realize that everything that we've been doing now is what has been causing land degradation. It's what's been causing the whole climate change phenomenon. It's been how we've changed, how we've been progressing in development. So instead of growing what we've been creating sustainably, we've been sort of degrading our land and not really considering our planet in the process. So when we're talking about climate action, people start thinking, okay, it's something that I can't do anything about as an individual, but they don't realize that in your own home, you can contribute so much towards actually ensuring that the environment is safer and is cleaner and is less degraded. And then Anna also emphasized on the issue of policymakers, right? And now that I have Judicial Bay, let's just get it in there. I've been looking at some of the laws around our environment and just trying to see how our policymakers are also trying to ensure that our environment is well protected. Just recently, there was a lot of noise around mining within the Hwange National Park. You remember that issue, yeah? The government was saying it's okay for a certain organization to mine within the Hwange National Park. Great, there are resources in there, but it's our game park, and it's tourism, and it's our heritage. But then they did reverse it, but they only banned mining in game parks. But there's nothing that you can say is actually in our mining laws that makes it as explicitly illegal as it actually should be. From my reading of the Mines and Minerals Amendment Bill, which is likely to repeal the Mines Act, it only goes as far as saying in deciding whether or not to grant a mineral right or title, the cadastre registrar shall take into account the need to conserve the natural resources in or on the land over which the mineral right or title is. I mean, so in other words, what this is saying is it's left to officials to decide. There's no certainty in the way that that provision was actually framed. In my view, no one must be given room to exercise discretion where it concerns environmental conservation. So these are some of the issues that you're looking at. We're looking at how we've been trying to also ensure that there's development within our country, but also not looking at how we are doing this sustainably, build back better. Looking at how Cyclone Idai happened, and we're trying to build back better. Are we building buildings that we know can actually withstand some of the climate change phenomena that are coming through now because of how we've been developing? We're not really looking at stuff like that. It's okay, we just want to get development into our country, but where is the sustainability in this? Let's try to go back. How was it done before? Let's see where we went wrong and try to fix it from there. So yes, it's a sort of like we have to go back to then build back better. So I don't know. I'm sort of really icked about stuff like that. We have to find ways of developing, of coming up, of fixing the livelihoods of our people, but we need to find sustainable means, sustainable ways of actually doing this, protecting our environment and protecting our people at the same time.
Some very interesting and powerful points being brought by the panel today. Of course, we've got Anna Brazil, who is our consultant from the Sustainable Development Goal perspective. We've got Rumbidzai Takawira as, of course, the Wildlife Conservancy Ambassador, and Carl Joshua Ngcobe, who is the CEO of ICAIA, as we continue to have a conversation around this and see how you and I, wherever we are, can do what we can to ensure that we attain the SDGs. Remember, one thing that you can actually do right now is you can take the UN 75 1-minute survey. Just 1 minute of your time, you can get to answer some of the questions that you or address some of the challenges that you feel need to be addressed from a UN perspective. So go ahead, you can find it on www.un75.online. Carl, Ruby was just mentioning a few things here. There was the talk of legislation. I know for a fact that we've been having challenges with our legislation, which in some certain quarters people think is kind of archaic. We've seen challenges with, those metal containers being renovated into homes. We've seen maybe obviously legislation. I don't know if you've encountered challenges in terms of legislation of turning, that bus that you have into your home and just creating an ecosystem where other people can do that. In terms of legislation, is everything on point, or maybe there needs to be an engagement to ensure that these issues are addressed?
Okay, I think what we have to, I'll go to a process called biomimicry, which is where, like most of the stuff that's been designed in the world has been sort of mimicking what we see in nature. And a lot of the solutions and the clues have come from nature for us to learn how to be better sort of custodians of the environment we live in. So planes have been designed according to that, and a lot of that. So one of the interesting things in biomimicry is that everything must start at a unit level. So with every living being, there's a DNA strand. With every molecule, there's an atom. It starts at a bottom level, and everything seems to know what to do until it becomes the sum of its parts. So for example, if you look at water, which is H2O, if you look at the water molecule, when they all come together, water is going to be water, whether it's just the molecule or it's a large body of water. And so when legislation comes in, and why there's been a failure from a legislative perspective, is because the minute you take a top-down approach, you're not going to solve actual problems. The problems have to be solved from the ground up. So if everybody in the country knows what is at stake and what they need to do, the leadership must start in the homes. The leadership must start in the communities. The leadership just doesn't start in terms of legislation. It's the people that vote in the legislators according to the things that are near and dear to them. So if climate change is not at their core or their agenda, then you're not going to vote in a legislator to look at the law from the perspective of your community. And so what we are noticing is that a lot of things from when we were colonized have eroded things. And this is why I was clapping hands when Anna was speaking, because when you go back, every time I've traveled around the world, I've heard things like tiny homes. Tiny homes is what people in the Zimbabwean rural areas live in, by the way. If you talk about growing your own food is what people in the rural areas do, by the way. If you look at community gardens are things that happen in the rural areas as it is. So a lot of the things have already been happening that we were already doing. But since we've been colonized, we've been taking on the mistakes of the world. And now we're coming back to the realization that, in fact, the very people that we colonized already knew. We use big words, conservation. Remember, all of us have totems that have animals. The reason why we have totems that have animals was to protect, to be custodians of those particular animals. So if you go into the rural areas and you start talking conservation to us is not that word. It's a spiritual thing. It's part of how we lived. It's part of our history. So the framing of that knowledge and information is absolutely important. And this is why I was applauding there, because it's about going back. The superfoods that we're talking about, that Oprah talks about on a cooking show, these are things that were already being grown by my grandmother. You can't come and tell me that now I have to watch television just to learn something that was in the rural areas. There's fresh air in the rural areas, the very thing that the rest of the world is failing to get. Why do you think there's less incidences of COVID within our rural areas? The immune systems that are there, people already are not doing the things that they're not sitting in aircon units the whole day. They're sitting in a rural hut, in which case they wake up when the sun comes up. It's not an alarm clock. It's not the hum of your phone. These are things that were already ingrained in our culture. And it's very important for us to know in our messaging that we're not teaching anybody anything new in the rural areas. In fact, we're going back to ask for forgiveness and say, you were right. All this time, you were right. This is the reason why in Zimbabwe, we've got such a warped mentality. I want to drive a big car. I want to do this. Go to the rural areas. Go and tell me what the carbon emissions are. Go tell me that. Because, this whole discussion that we're having right now, as a comedian, I'm going around the world, such a hypocrite from plane to plane, talking about sustainability and issues, going from one TED conference to the next or whatever it is. To be honest, I really should be staying at home. This is the reason why I'm now living in a bus that's off grid and moving back to the rural areas. That's why our company is called Ekaya, because it's a journey back home, back to our roots, back to understanding. The actual truth is that we didn't need to wait for the UN to tell us this. In fact, we should have been the consultants to the UN to say, hey, hang on, let's show you how houses should be built. Round, small, with grass huts, control the cooling so that we don't actually have these kind of problems that we currently have. The Tonga were building on stilts. They didn't have to clear land to build their houses on stilts. Nice cooling system. Zimbabwe should be consulting.
Well, quite interesting and very valid points that you bring about there. Just getting onto our conversation there, which is on Facebook. There's a quick question here, and I think I'll address it to Anna. He says, quick question. Any quick ideas for those farmers who are currently preparing for the farming season and in regard to especially climate action?
Okay, so this year we've been told by the scientists that we're going to get a good rainfall year. And I think farmers need to take huge advantage of this because we may not get another good rainfall year for quite a long time. So it's very important for farmers to plant a wide range of different crops. Don't just plant one crop. In fact, this should be the mantra for every single year. And ironically, it's what people used to do in the past. In the past, people would never just grow one crop. They would always grow many, many different types of crops. So make sure that you get as much from your land as possible. Try and plant as many different varieties, plant varieties that are relevant for your particular area. Don't just plant what everyone else is planting, but do a little bit of research to find out which crops do well in your area. Although we've been told we're going to get a good rainfall season, we don't know how much rain that is going to be in terms of how it's spread out. The computer models just tell us that it's going to be average in terms of the number of millimeters in total, but we could get all that rain in 3 days, or we could get little bits throughout the season, which is what we hope we're going to get. So don't think you know what's going to happen. And again, the best way to make sure that you can deal with this is by planting as many different crops as possible, and include a lot of indigenous crops that you know are going to do well, like sorghum, millet, cowpeas, round nuts, as many different pumpkins, because if it's going to be a heavy rainfall year, then the cucurbits will do well. But make sure that you plant them on well-drained soil or plant them on mounds so that they grow properly. The other thing that's going to be a worry this year, probably just because it's becoming more of a worry, is pests and diseases. So keep vigilant in your fields. As soon as you start noticing pests or diseases, take action. We like to encourage people not to reach for the chemicals immediately as soon as you see a pest or disease. So a lot of pest and disease problems can be controlled using natural remedies. Some of the indigenous knowledge that I gathered, it included tons of natural remedies. And in fact, ash was widely used in the past, and it's a really good pest control method. Ash is something that all insects hate. So a lot of shop bought pesticides are powders, really just because ash was the most effective things to use. Insects hate powders. So look at the indigenous methods first, and then if it gets really out of control, as a last resort, reach for the other chemicals. But really what we should be doing in Zimbabwe is phasing out chemicals. And as a long-term thing as well, we really need to look at our soil and thinking about improving the soil. So the more plants that you can grow that give you food and improve the soil, the better. That means planting a lot of legumes, beans, cowpeas, ground nuts, anything that's going to put nutrition back into the soil is very, very important. And that should be the long term. The more we invest in our soil, the more we're going to be able to survive climate change, because the soil is the foundation. Also, if you want to reduce your local heating in your area and try and conserve water, try to avoid chopping down trees. Okay, people go on and on about tree chopping, and they you know, it's the mantra in Zimbabwe, don't chop trees down, but everyone's still chopping trees down. I mean, in Kristen Banks at the moment, there's a massive massacre of Mzanji trees, which is so depressing because that was always a place I would sneak in and get Mzanjis, but no longer. Okay, trees are not just nice, pretty things to hug. Trees have got millions of functions. They're absolutely vital. If you chop down the trees, we will lose our soil. If you chop down the trees, water will not be able to sink into the soil and our wells will dry up. So trees have got so many functions. If we keep chopping them down, we are not going to be able to produce food anymore. And that's the basic truth.
Right. Thank you for that. I'll come back to you, and we want to discuss a bit more about the superstitious beliefs and how they've been affecting issues to do with, climate action, especially. Let's talk about afforestation. We'll talk about that a bit later. But Rumbi, I want to come to you and just find out more. We're talking about human-wildlife conflict, and we know already that water bodies have been a source of conflict among human beings, and it's, already being predicted by some people saying that water will be one of the biggest areas of conflict for human beings in the future. But let's talk about the human-wildlife conflict with regards to water bodies. Currently, you've talked about issues of poisons. You've also talked about it's every human being, every living thing needs water. How's that situation been?
As Anna has sort of spoken about how we're hoping that this rain season is going to be as sort of been predicted to be or forecasted, but because the rains have been quite errant in the country or just in the region, just so to speak, the rains have ensured that our rivers are drying up. I remember I was in Chegutu just a couple of days ago, and there's a river that was totally dried up. And what did I see there? I saw people mining across that riverbed. I was just in shock. Well, there is no water. So look at areas where there's wildlife, for example. Wildlife is looking for water. And if you have a borehole in your rural homestead, animals are going to definitely come there because there's always water in that area. There's always plants that are growing there. So the animals then tend to encroach into human living spaces. In Hwange, they've been trying to come up with some water bodies. They're creating water reservoirs for animals to come through and drink from those areas. So you'll see that some of the elephants are coming through even from Botswana to come and get water from Hwange National Park. And that's just one example. And you'll see that because the water is such a challenge, so many animals are actually dying because of the lack of water. And when they do travel all those kilometers from Botswana to come to Zimbabwe to drink the water within Hwange National Park, because they haven't eaten anything and they haven't had any water for such a long time, by the time they then drink the water that is in that reservoir that has been created, they actually tend to die. So we're actually losing more animals at this point in time because we don't have enough water. They'll come and they'll drink too much and they'll die from drinking too much water. So people need to understand that this issue of water and trying to assist our animals and trying to assist ourselves and ensuring that we've got enough water is a big issue. I was in Lupane also recently, and what they've been doing in that area is ensuring that they're doing the drip irrigation. So we're trying to come up with climate smart techniques, climate smart agricultural techniques to ensure that we are still food sufficient, and also ensuring that our communities are well taken care of, and we can also create these water reservoirs for our animals. So if you're looking at some of those things like drip irrigation and planting of the traditional grains, like what Anna was talking about, those are climate smart agricultural techniques that are going to assist in ensuring that the little water that we have, we are utilizing it to the fullest to ensure that we can still survive and we can still go on. But we need to find a way of then ensuring that the human and wildlife conflict that then comes into play has to be dealt with in some way. it's a situation where we all have to come in and work together to ensure that we are protecting each other. We are all, it's supposed to protect each other. So in a way, we have to come up with climate smart agricultural techniques, just come up with ways of ensuring that the little water that we have in our homes right now, we're going into the showers and just going on like everything is all right. And this is from the household level. Try to conserve the little water that you have in your home. You know, you can't now be sitting in a tub full of water. Yes, you've got a borehole, you've got water that is coming, but let's try to be considerate of what is happening within the planet and what's happening in the surrounding, in our surroundings, because at some point we're not going to have enough water whatsoever. And there's so many areas, so many residential areas that haven't had water for years, 10 years, for example. They have to buy water. And we don't really tend to take this seriously or as if it's important, but the more we continue using water carelessly, at some point, we're not going to have clean water to actually deal with, to actually drink, to actually cook with. You know, so many people are drinking dirty water from these dried up rivers. They've dug up little wells within the dried up rivers, and they're just getting water, and it's not clean water, and it's not safe. It's a tough situation. In Plumtree, there were animals that we could see, elephants drinking water right next to cattle. So these elephants are coming into where a water reservoir has been created for the domestic animals in that area. But now wild animals are coming into that area because there's no water within the conservancies. So they're coming through. That's where human and wildlife conflict has been happening. You see so many cattle that have been killed there around that reservoir. Many people have been attacked by lions. Many people have been attacked by elephants because there's no water, and there's that fight for the water. And it's really depressing when you really look at it and try to think, what are some of the solutions that we can then bring into play to ensure that we've got sustainable water for everybody.
Thank you very much, Rubis, for those contributions. Carl, my next question is two-pronged. It's for you. The first one is kind of building on what you alluded to earlier in terms of the education system, of how, you know, things from a rural perspective are run. My first question for you, Carl, is how intact is the information that our brothers and our sisters that are in the rural areas still have when you compare to the dilution that has happened to most of the people living in urban areas, and there's such a disconnect? My first question for you is, how intact is the knowledge base for some of these practices that you were talking about? Then secondly, I wanted to find out, taking on the issue of water, you're the CEO of ICAYA, and obviously concerns come through when people talk about living in a station or in a space that is akin to yours. How have you solved the water challenge, and as well as just so that the person also lives comfortably, even if it's in an eco-friendly manner?
Okay, so to answer the first question, in terms of information, there's a wide range of information that's scattered across generations. A lot of it has died. Now, let me take a capitalist approach to this. In order for a capitalist to get anything to make money, they have to present it in such a way that a person is going to buy that product, or they're going to see it as being worth doing. So, for example, if you look at countries like Australia, when it comes to the ratings, the energy ratings of the houses, your house has to be energy rated for you to benefit in terms of either tax concessions and that sort of thing. How much rainwater are we harvesting in Zimbabwe? And what's the benefit of harvesting the rainwater? If there's no benefit, then nobody is going to do it. We have to be able to tie these things to a monetary gain of some kind of, because not all of us are going to care about the environment because we simply love our planet. A lot of the things that we currently do make no sense. There's no sense why you would drive a red sports car. There's just no logic to it, but people do it. But there's a lot of sense in saving the planet. But has it been presented like the red sports car? No. And this is what we need to actually look at. So from an ICAYA perspective, what we're saying is that, listen, if I'm such an environmentalist, then I must walk the talk. I must be willing to move to the rural areas, build my house using energy efficient methods, build the most fantastic house using energy efficient methods, attract enough tourists to come and see my house so that everybody around me actually says, you know, there's actually a benefit for me looking after the environment, because just down the road from every rural household that's next to the national park is the safari business that has paid a lot of money to pump water into pans so that animals can come and drink, so that visitors can see them, so that they can make money from that particular process. Just across the road is a village where same animal comes and it's labeled as a human-animal conflict. Now here is the disparity between those two things. Does this person know that there's a benefit to this animal coming? And if so, is there anyone lobbying for them to be resourced to be able to extract this value? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you can't then just tell this person that human-animal conflict and then send pamphlets or whatever it is, but still this person's just trying to grow a crop because they're trying to feed their family. So as a company, what we're doing is that we're just looking at the aspects and saying, what would happen if you took a community, like our community is between Victoria Falls town and the airport. Now, why is all the vegetables in Victoria Falls being brought in from outside of Victoria Falls for the major hotels? Why is that happening? Is there no possibility that I could negotiate or lobby for a contract farming idea within this particular community, set up the necessary infrastructure to protect their crops, and then supply at a commercial rate these vegetables so that this community benefits? But not only that, can I also then not use that voice to attract people to see a smart village in action so that it also builds up like wildfire, starting out with all the villages that are next to all the tourist attractions, then moving into the other communities to say, listen, do you know that farm-to-table restaurants are the big thing now? Do you know that this green living is the big thing? There's many students willing to travel from abroad to come and live and do a residency in your village to exchange this knowledge. These are all things that we're saying that if this information is not just about extracting old information, but it's using new information to enhance the little old that we know about our communities to try and make them more sustainable, more commercially viable.
Very much, Carl, there. Getting some contributions there. I don't know who wants to. I think it will be this one. You can jump in, or Carl as well. Nigel asking, how do you manage the human-animal conflict, especially in these COVID times? What can we learn from Victoria Falls and Hwange? And then the second question here is saying, how do we increase knowledge within our communities about the importance of wetlands? Don't get me started on wetlands, because that's a whole story. And again, it has to do with how in the urban areas we've totally lost the plot. You see mansions, you see churches, you see all sorts of places being built on wetlands. You won't see such a thing, Umusha. You won't see that in the rural areas, but I guess that's another conversation for another day. But the first question here, how do we manage the human-animal conflict, especially in this COVID times?
Should I? My first,
sure,
my first impression about this is like, when I moved to Victoria Falls, it's quite a close-knit community of people. Protecting a lot of things. There's a lot of discussions that happen. Unfortunately, these discussions are not as widespread as like getting into the mainstream about why certain things are the way that they are. Now, here's what the problem is. It becomes almost, and I'm not accusing Victoria Falls of being this, but conservation tends to then sound more elitist from the perspective of the rest of the communities. So what will tend to happen is that people will just think, oh, this is just a thing for white people. And eventually what you are going to get on the side is that people are going to start breaking that line. And when they do break that line, this is why you then get some ridiculous looking structures and projects that are happening that you ask yourself, how was this even approved? And that is because a lot of the times, as we're trying to conserve certain things, let's also be mindful of why we are. It's almost like if you ask your whole family to go on a diet and you're not explaining to them that, there's a heart attack that's coming later on, or these are the people that have died because of it. What will happen is that all your kids are going to sneak out and go and buy snacks. And none of what you're doing is going to work. And so we have to look at a way of being able to address the language and also the benefits of what it is that we're doing. We can't just go and stand up and say, oh, you cut down a tree. We shouldn't do that. We should have prizes for architects to build new building systems to change the narrative. Build cheaper houses, better houses, nicer looking houses. Don't just say that cutting the tree is bad. We already know this. It's the same as saying the Zimbabwean economy is bad. So what? We now know the problems. What we want to know is, how are you going to make this solution not kill my livelihood? Last point. When we talk about things like poaching and so on, let's just remember, poaching only became a problem after we were colonized. We had lots more animals before we were colonized. So what actually caused the demand is not the person who's killing the animal. It's the guy in that Western country buying the stuff for the Asian markets. That's where you need to actually arrest the problem. Because if tomatoes became the new big thing, trust me, there'll be tomatoes being grown everywhere. The issue is that who's causing the demand, not so much who's causing the problem on the ground. And I think we address the problem from the wrong angle of saying, let's stop the poaching by talking to the villagers. You can't talk to a villager who's being given money, guys, money, actual cash, to kill an animal that he's not even going to use. And somewhere in that argument is to say, you're going to stay with the meat. I just need the horns to take to whatever market. Through shelf companies, through fronts, through everything. And we all know who the big players are, and we won't talk about them. That's what needs to be addressed. And it's not even at a country level. We're talking in Western countries. That's where a lot of this is happening. There's traders, there's curators that are sending this stuff to these markets. It's not happening at the village level, guys. There's a much bigger conversation right up at the top.
Well, again, which brings us to the point that this conversation definitely needs to be continuing. You can go ahead on the 263 chat page on Facebook and on Twitter, as well as on UN in Zimbabwe. As we get to talk about this, it will be very interesting if the next time we can actually get a government official or somebody who's in a policy-making level to be able to come and, address some of the questions that people might have regarding these issues. And what is so ironic in my discovery is that as I said earlier on, people think that because they are called SDGs and they're so lofty and far divorced from us. But when we start to talk about it, these are issues that are affecting all of us every single day. I had alluded, Anna, to the question that in your experience, because obviously traditional belief system have got their pros and they've got their cons. And I understand that a couple of months ago, there was a company that donated some trees to afforest a particular area in Zimbabwe here. But then there was talk around we need to remove those trees because if that particular breed of tree loses a leaf, someone is going to die in the community. So we see traditional beliefs like this prevailing in some rural areas. Yes, it's true, Carl. It's very true. But if you experience anything like that, and how do you reckon we need to address some of those issues?
You wanted me to answer the question. So, I mean, one of the, I don't know, I felt a bit worried when you said superstitions, MacDonald. I think superstitions is such a colonial word, and it's something that, every what we call superstition has got a little element of truth or usefulness in there somewhere. So one thing that I learned a huge amount from this Indigenous knowledge project that I was doing is that certain Indigenous trees have a huge spiritual value, as well as practical value. They produce fruit, they produce wood, they produce leaves, but also they're considered to be areas where ceremonies are carried out, and people are restricted from using those trees in any way unless they get permission to do so. Now, although that may seem like a superstition, it's got a huge practical value. We've already talked about why it's important to conserve trees. So we could either just say, let's get rid of superstitions and let's just get everyone to focus on science. But unfortunately, as we've seen, science isn't a very sexy idea. If science was appealing to people, then people wouldn't be causing climate change or environmental destruction, because science tells us that it's completely ridiculous to do such a thing. So science doesn't really work for people. And I think this links to what Joshua was saying, Carl was saying. You've got to make ideas appealing to people. You've got to turn them into a red sports car to make people want to do them. Now, in the past, traditional concepts, traditional religion. That was the red sports car for people. And to a lot of people, that red sports car still appeals. So when we were looking at Cyclone Idai, we were doing a documentary on Cyclone Idai earlier this year, and we talked to people in Chimanimani. We got a lot of discussion about Juzi, mermaids, and spiritual beings, and the fact that the ancestors felt they'd been insulted, and that was why the cyclone had happened. Now, should we go to people and say, well, no, that's not true. In fact, the cyclone happened because of air masses and heating over the ocean and stuff like that? Or should we just go with what people already appreciate and understand and say, yeah, don't annoy the spiritual beings and then you won't get cyclones? Because in a way, it's saying the same kind of thing. In Zimbabwe, spirituality is very much linked to environmental protection. So if you encourage people to respect that culture, then you're just going to get the same result, which is environmental protection. Then for younger people, you've got to make the red sports car a bit more appealing in a modern sense. So you've got to work quite hard to do that. And I think that Carl and other people have been doing a lot of work on that. I feel I'm probably a bit too old, but I'm trying with my work through youth groups. But I think social media is very, very important here. How do we make the environment sexy? And we can't mess around. We don't have time. We've got to do it as quickly as possible. But I think use different methods for different groups and look at what already appeals to people and work with that. That's my suggestion.
All right, Moses, for courses in thank you for that.
And I'm going to throw in there just
sure.
Just as Anna has been talking about those superstitions, as you had mentioned it, and you realize that we are developing well into very remote areas now. If you're looking at power lines, for example, or if you're looking at mining operations, if you're looking at so many just building, we're going deep into the most remote areas at this point in time. And sometimes we tend not to then consider the communities that have been living in those areas for time immemorial. I saw a documentary somewhere online. I understand the Zimbabwe Power Company is creating new power lines in a certain remote area, and they were telling the communities in that area that we will move you to a better space. We need our power lines to pass through here because your home will be underneath our power line. But then there was a tree that was in a specific homestead, and they said, this is where we come and we pray, and this tree has never been cut down in such a long time, for years and years, and you want to cut down this tree and you want to move us to a certain area. So there also comes a need for us to appreciate what's been happening within the communities. We've been living well before being colonized. We have been living in certain ways, and now that we are developing, we still have to find a way of harnessing and ensuring that this is still well taken care of and preserved, without then having to encroach into people's beliefs, into people's traditional belief systems, just so to speak. So we have to find a way. There has to be a win-win in everything. Yes, development is important, but we have to consider communities that have been living in those areas. And just a quick one, McDonald, someone was asking how we can deal with human and wildlife conflict, and you did mention that we really hope that there was a government official in this, because it all comes down to policy making. There has to be an adoption of at least a human wildlife mitigation policy. Government has to come in and take responsibility of resolving some of those human wildlife issues. Land use planning, very important. The whole issue of building on wetlands. This all has to be done from a policy point of view, and also just considering all the communities within the most remote areas or in areas surrounding these wildlife conservancies. At the end of the day, we have to find a way, revising legislation, coming up with policy, problem animal control units, for example, funding the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority. These are some of the things that really need to be done to ensure that we are protecting our people in these areas surrounding the animal conservancies, and also ensuring that we're still developing in a sustainable manner.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that contribution, Rizai. Well, if you're with us for the past hour, you would know that we're talking about the growing trends in issues action. And the most interesting and ironic thing, though, is that as we're talking about developing and growing trends, it seems that to get the solution, we're actually having to go back to center, back to number one, back to how it used to be from our forefathers, in order to actually ensure that we live in harmony with our environment. We live in harmony with, of course, animals as well as other human beings. But to just cap off our conversation, our time is fast running out on us, and we had a fantastic panel. But I'll just allow you, ladies and gentlemen, to just give us your final remarks, and if you could point it towards where to from here, where to from this conversation, where to in terms of progression along this conversation. I'll start off with you, Anna.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for inviting me to be on this. It's also always very important to talk about climate action. I mean, people ramble on and on about climate change and negotiations and all that type of stuff. And I think I would just like to agree with what the other panelists have said, is especially what Carl was saying, is we've got to start with the people, because unfortunately policymakers have really failed us up until now, and it doesn't look as if, well, they seem to be so embroiled in their current problems that they don't really seem to be focusing on the crisis at hand, and it is a major crisis. So I think the next step is for communities to believe in themselves and to take courage from the fact that their forefathers and foremothers survived in much more difficult conditions than the ones that we currently survive in, and they thrived. And we must look back, but we must also look forward. So we should take the best of the knowledge from the past and use it as ammunition to deal with the fight that's going to happen in the future, because the future is quite a worrying place that we're going to have to deal with, and so we're going to need everything that we have in the pool of human knowledge to deal with it.
Thank you very much, Anna. Murumbi, your final sentiments?
Well, all I can say is we need to educate our communities. We can.
Hello, seem to be losing. Rumbi? Okay, seem to be losing Rumbi a bit there. I'll try to just get a hold of it. But
can
Carl,
you hear me now?
Fantastic, you're back. Yeah, you can continue.
I was saying that the issue of actually understanding our communities and knowing that this has been done, this continues to be done, and we can learn so much from the communities. Like Anna was saying, that so many our policymakers have been letting us down, and they're focusing on many other different issues within their jurisdiction, so to speak. But just understanding that climate action is for each and every sector, no matter what it is that you do. Climate action is something that you need to put into your future plans. Look at how you can sustainably build your business. Look at how best you can sustainably build the community that you want to build in. If you want to create whatever it is that you're creating, just look for the most sustainable ways of doing this. It doesn't matter you are in mining. It does not matter you are in agriculture. It doesn't matter you are in public relations. Every single sector is affected by climate change and climate action and by the environment. So if there's a way that everybody can be educated, all the communities can be educated, even on wildlife conservation issues and how to control wild animals, it's important that we go out there, give information, even in ways that they understand within those specific communities. Because if you go there and you just say, this is our wildlife heritage and our tourism depends on this, they don't see the benefit of that, because they're not getting the benefits that come from the tourism. For example, in the rural areas, they're not getting the opportunities that the tourism sector is getting. So they're not getting that trickle down money that is coming into the communities. So it comes back now to also all those resorts that have surrounding communities, assist in those communities, find ways of educating the people in those communities, and let them see the value that comes with our economic advantages of having wildlife, economic advantages of having a great environment, having indigenous trees, and just ensuring that our environment is safe, and that we're creating food security also for our nation. So I think the major emphasis for me is educating the communities and creating an environmental conservation awareness in every single facet.
Thank you very much, Rombi. Carl, your final words?
I'm happy to be able to pitch that as a company, Ekhaya, we are here to actually build $100 million company listed on a stock exchange, which basically is actually going to show the actual value that rural communities have, not only from the harvesting of our biogas, looking after our trees, being able to sell off our cultural assets for the rest of the world, to see smarter, greener villages, for us to lead the actual discussion in the solutions, the IP, the patents, all of the ideas are going to come from us. We are here to actually put our money where our mouth is and actually say, listen, if the environment is that important, then it has to be of some value. And that value, we're basically taking it to you and telling you that we're going to build $100 million company out of it. If that is not going to prove to people that the environment is that important and looking after the environment is that profitable, well, we're about to show people that's exactly how it's going to happen.
Well, there you go. Thank you very much, Carl, for those contributions there. And that's what we had for you today on this webinar. Is we talked about the growing trends, and as I alluded to earlier, coming through from the panelists, that it as growing trends are actually, going back to the past, so that we can get into the future. And we need to preserve our cultural heritage, our ideals, our farming methods, our interaction with nature. And if you want to go ahead and put a contribution to this conversation or other issues that you feel are pertinent to you, go ahead and log on to www.un75.online. Fill in the UN 1 Minute Survey, which was launched this year by the Secretary General, Dr. Antonio Guterres. And it was just getting every single person to be involved in creating and making a change to their lives, to the society around them. On the show today, I had Sustainable Development Co-Consultant Anna Brazia. I also had Wildlife Conservancy Ambassador Zaita Kawira, aka Judicial Bay. And then, of course, I also had Culture Shonuli, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Ekhaya. Thank you so much for gracing this discussion in this panel, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, McDonald. It was great to be a part of this.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, fantastic.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, McDonald. Yeah.
Yes, fantastic. So let's make a date again next week for another conversation around how you and I can make a positive change in the future. My name is McDonald Gurura. This has been another webinar brought to you courtesy of the United Nations in Zimbabwe. So it's on the 263 chat platform. Go ahead, like it, share it, and let's get to converse and let's make positive changes in our lives. Until next time, bye. You take care.